All right, welcome everyone to the next edition of 30 Minutes with a Hacker. This is Jade Whitty. I'm with Tech Data as a solutions practice consultant, and I've got Brett Scott here and Josh Harp, two ethical hackers who are in the trenches every day and are giving us their insights into ways that the hacking community is getting into to locations. And the topic today is how can you prevent from getting hacked if you don't have, let's say, endpoint security in place. What are some of the ways that hackers are getting into systems currently? So I'll go ahead and let Josh or Brett.
So hi there, this is Brett Scott, and I'm Director with Solutions Development here at Tech Data. And one of the things that we'd like to talk about is how are companies dealing with the threats that they're encountering every day when they don't have certain technologies in place. And so there are some answers, and of course, things get easier when you have the solutions in place, but there are ways that a company can address the lack of endpoint security, the threats, the 0 days, the phishing, all of those things that are occurring. 85% of the breaches that are affecting companies today are actually coming from insider compromised credentials. So that means somebody either went to a phishing website or some other place that they have an account got compromised, and they share passwords across systems. It could be that there was a breach within their company. It could be an insider threat in that somebody exfiltrated data about all the logins internally. But no matter what they are, it ends up being detonating some kind of malicious software on the endpoints of the workstations within that company. This is a prolific problem, and of course, the bad guys are only looking to get a single beachhead on any one of the systems anywhere in the company, and then what they do is called lateral movement, where they then try to hop from computer to computer to eventually get to what their targets are. And all of that activity is well documented. The problem is companies are really bad at finding that. It usually takes over 200 days for a company to figure out that somebody has already breached their network. And this represents a tremendous threat. Worse than that, coming up in the next year, in 2020, there is this thing called the CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act. So if GDPR, General Data Privacy Regulation over in the EU, if that didn't affect you, you will be affected by CCPA, similar things. So now there is an even greater, more costly consequence for failure to detect these breaches. So now more than ever, it's important for companies to have their heads on straight, to have policies in place, and to have the ability to find bad guys and remove them before they become too much liability for the company to survive.
Okay. Josh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
About integrating endpoint security into your enterprise? Well, it's one of the spokes on the wheel, so to speak, for general security of an organization. Most people will have a HIDS agent, a host intrusion detection system, is what that HIDS acronym breaks down to, but that's monitoring systems and processes going on, and will create alerts or alarms based upon if a certain action takes place. A lot of these actions would be pre-scripted or software-based, but now a lot of what attackers are doing is what comes into play with next-gen endpoint security, where they're trying to detect anomalies not based on certain attributes a user might or attributes a user would take. So you can talk about living off the land techniques or PowerShell-based execution. What could be of concern and what most people don't monitor for is if you are doing system updates or system patches, endpoint security will sometimes be turned off. So what that doesn't occur is an alarm isn't generated when endpoint security is turned off. So an attacker might not attempt to bypass endpoint security altogether with different encoding methods or ciphering their payloads in a certain way. They may just write a PowerShell script that will temporarily turn off the system itself when they attempt to go and execute a vulnerability within the system. This is what you would call a multistage payload. So the first form of infection isn't what's going to trigger the alarm or isn't what's going to trigger your endpoint security. It's going to go and try and pull down an additional payload, which is now working to do those bypass measures. So if one of the things we talk about here at Tech Data is a holistic approach to your security, if endpoint protection isn't something you are doing, it should be what you are doing, and your detection is as good as your monitoring, right? So you need to be monitoring those alarms and the system that data that's coming from those systems to be able to detect when someone is trying to do multi-stage payload or exploit of the system.
So if I'm understanding you, they're downloading let's say the first stage of a payload,
yeah.
And that may be simply to turn off the
right. So it could be an enumeration-based script. So if we talk about multi-stage payload in the form of social engineering, because that's a primary way an adversary is going to get into the organization from outside, people are mostly concerned about their perimeter. So we think of a castle, right? From a perimeter security perspective, a castle is going to be secured because you have your knights at every watchtower, you have your drawbridges, you may have your moat with alligators in it or whatever it might be, that now from a perimeter-based security, you're good. But if you talk about how did knights in the days of old infiltrate these large castles with good security, a lot of the time they came through the places nobody wanted to go or nobody wanted to see, or they would piggyback off of other civilians coming into the town or whatever it might be. So multi-stage payload and social engineering, we're talking about I would craft a malicious document, whether that be a PDF or a Word document. The PDF could have embedded JavaScript. The Word document could have dynamic data exchange, DDE forms of exploit, which none of that is going to trigger your endpoint security solution, because these are methods that the documents themselves are supposed to execute. So they're using the software against itself to cause the execution to go. So your DDE, if you have that in a malicious Word document, goes out to its remote server, pulls down one PowerShell script. That PowerShell script may be used to get a general profile of your system. So check system processes, see what type of software is running on your system. If you have endpoint security, is it Symantec? Is it Titan or one of these other players in the space? And then in doing so, there may be a 0-day, as Brett mentioned, against that software that they could use to weaponize and bypass it altogether. Or they could say, okay, I'm going to write a system scheduled task to just turn it off when the user's not there, or when the user is there but they're executing additional tasks. Depends upon the way the adversary wants to go about it. And then from there, once that is all turned off, the next stage in the attack could already be within that PowerShell script, but it might not execute because the endpoint protection solution is turned back on, or another circumstance, or it could go and download its other additional payload to execute an additional portion. So they don't include everything in their first payload. They may split it up and then couple it together later to also bypass endpoint security.
Josh, it sounds like much of what you're talking about is dependent upon administrator or root level access to a system in order to do things like scheduled tasks and things. So is it fair to say, from a security perspective, one defense is controlling access to admin credentials?
Yeah, it is your top or a bottom up type of approach for purpose of least privileges, right? Does your HR representative need to be able to execute administrative tasks on her system? Not necessarily, but does an executive need to be able to install different types of software to be able to execute tasks without having to wait 2 days or 3 days for the help desk to approve something?
Data would say no.
So it does depend upon your security policies and procedures, but sometimes, even though that we think that is the most common thing, administrators do a lot of the times get lazy. There have been conversations with administrators in the past that they say, I know security is important, but I need to be able to just not handle the low tasks of getting someone software, and they just need to be able to do that on their own. So, you know, it's a perspective of what is important within your organization and what are the policies and procedures you need to put in place to make sure that these types of measures don't occur. But you would be surprised that a standard domain user with non-administrative tasks, their system is executing root level or system level privileges on the box. So a way an adversary might go about it is they'll hook into those root level or system level privileged software and execute based upon that. Copy its PID, say I am it, and then it will run even without having a root password or system level access. This is what you would consider elevation of privileges techniques and things of that nature.
So what he's talking about there is the attack is not just a monolithic, this thing is punching through the gate. You'll see that it is a multi-staged and adaptive threat. And so because of that, you essentially, you might say, well, golly, that's really hard to fight, but you can also look at it as they're going to have to take multiple bites at this thing before they can effectively harm my organization. Each time that they take a bite, one or more of your security systems in place might be able to help you detect that and immediately begin the process of interdicting and or exfiltrating that person from your network. So one of the things that we talk about is important is watching your wire. So Tech Data offers a solution called Recon SOC, and that is where other people watch the wire on behalf of your company. So all of their security devices and all the things that are helping you to monitor the network talk to what's called a SIEM tool, and that integrates all that data. People who know what they're looking at then look at that data and say, gosh, it seems like something has happened here. I want to investigate that. And then they pursue it. So if you did very little for your security, the least amount of thing that you should be doing is having somebody with expertise watch the wire on your behalf, and that's why Recon SOC is in play.
And our partners are putting together solutions like this. Recon SOC is something that they can position with their end user customers.
Absolutely, and think of that as investment in the continuation of your relationship with your customer. Most companies go out of business within 6 months of a serious breach. So that is a minor investment in the continuity of your customer so that you don't have to go out and hunt and find a new place to do business. So preserving your customer's cybersecurity is actually good for your business because that good customer that's been your customer for a long time won't be if they get a serious breach within 6 months. So you want to do that. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, there are other layers to the security model that you can put in place. But ultimately, you want to have something that is an endpoint security, something that is on the workstations, is on the mobile phones, is on these devices that will help you and assist your administrators in looking at what's going on. So imagine if you had to have one person observe every computer in your office. It's really hard to do that because from the single point of view of a person observing, it's very difficult to stay on top of all the details of what everybody's doing. What endpoint security does for you is it puts eyes on all of the systems that are out there and allows your customer to then see everything that is happening all along, but it is coming in as data instead of being a requirement of one person to observe it all. So your end customer should definitely include the two ends of the cybersecurity suite, which is Recon SOC and then an endpoint security solution, so that they have more opportunities to detect those multi-stage attacks.
Okay. Do you want to add anything to that? I'll ask you a question because you talked about PowerShell scripting as one of the things that they invent. In layman's terms, not super tech. Yeah. What is a PowerShell script?
So PowerShell was a utility built by Microsoft into all versions of Windows starting after Vista, and it was meant to be an instrumentation tool for administrators. So if I needed to automate a task as applying security updates across my enterprise, I could write a simple PowerShell script to do it. Another method would be, say, I need to do an inventory survey. So this is a common thing a lot of people don't do within their organizations to see what assets they do have and if it's changed between what they originally took as a baseline to what they have now. You could use a PowerShell to do an inventory survey to say, okay, what hosts are on my network? who are the users on those hosts, what software is installed on those hosts. And there are additional layers into PowerShell which take on administrative-based roles or procedures. But PowerShell was, at its core, its intent was to be for administrators. It was meant to be used legitimately within an organization. But because of how much power Microsoft had given to it, attackers saw it as an opportunity to be used for their own means. Because there's a way that even if someone set a PowerShell-based policy within their enterprise to say executives, they're not likely to know what PowerShell is and they shouldn't be able to execute it. You can bypass PowerShell with an execution. You can bypass that policy within PowerShell to execute at an administrative level, because it's to say, what if my help desk representative has to go on site and help the executive with something and they needed to execute PowerShell to do it? Well, that policy shouldn't apply to the help desk personnel. They should just be able to run their scripts.
Mm-hmm.
So, common things that you thought this shouldn't happen, they are happening. Microsoft is making steps to limit the ability of what they gave to PowerShell, but everyone currently looking at and analyzing these steps they're taking are saying it isn't enough and it will still be abused.
We actually had a case that came to us yesterday, and it was a company that said, this is happening all over my network, and it looks like a bunch of gibberish. And what it was in fact, was a PowerShell script that had been multi-stage encrypted. So a human observing it says, this thing is percolating all over my network, but it looks like junk. But then we talked with them and said, you need to push this through an interpreter. And sure enough, that decoded all of that. And all of a sudden, they were looking at PowerShell script. By the way, not good PowerShell script. So again, this is the kinds of things that the bad guys are using to exploit the systems that they've got. We all have heard the statistics. It's very easy for them to find a way, either through social engineering or through just failures in security layers, to find a way to breach a system. Then, of course, what they do is once they have a toehold in your network, they're going to have to move laterally, and they will do so rather efficiently, especially when they can encrypt the code that's executing itself, especially when humans are the only ones responsible for cyber defense.
Okay. This is great. I'm trying to think if I know one of the things that we want to do on another call is a simulation, and we'll tee that up for the next 30-minute with a hacker call, where we actually show the difference between having an endpoint security solution in place and one where there's not, and what's happening. We'll have dual screens is the idea that we're thinking of how to illustrate this, to kind of give a sneak into what's actually happening when a hacker's trying to get in and simulate that.
I can help you understand this a little bit. So if you knew how we fought World War I, you essentially had field commanders, and these field commanders would rely on couriers that would come by with messages over a horseback or a carrier pigeon, etc. And so that would be messages from the front line, which would take amount of time to get to the commander. And then the commander sitting in a tent somewhere far away from the fighting would have to interpret what the message said, then say, oh, well, you should be doing this now, and then it would have to courier the information back. And because it was disconnected from the front line, that's very much like how you are securing a network when you don't have endpoint security in place. You are essentially relying upon the people who are observing the battlefield to make decisions as to what's happening at those endpoints and at the front lines, and then based on what they observe, make calculations as to how to deal with the problem. When you have endpoint security in place, it's very much like how we fought World War II, where we were using radios, and we would say, bad guys just came through my fence and I'm in trouble, help, I'm in this location. Because of that ability to speed the communication, the people who are trying to be responsible for the overall defense are able to use that information to react more quickly and more effectively against the enemy, rather than trying to conduct that through a very disconnected and slow medium of detection.
So if I'm understanding endpoint, you are protecting the device, but a big part of it is if you get past the device and you get in, that endpoint security is relaying that information back so that precautions can be, you can block certain databases, shut things down knowing that you've been breached at that level.
Absolutely. Help, I'm sick, I'm in trouble. Somebody has the ability to now say, wow, we should do something. Let's isolate this machine. Let's isolate this segment of the network that was on. When you do so, if you can do so in a timely fashion, you're talking about cutting into that 200 days of presence the bad guys are used to having. When you can cut that short, and again, you now have 200 days to get that done, you're going to win most of the time. And your customers, more importantly, are going to be the ones that continue their business because they don't suffer a massive breach, which puts them out of business within 6 months.
So how do you know, let's say there's malware, there's viruses, there's phishing, 0 days, different things of ways in. How does the endpoint device, endpoint security solution know and that's just been breached and then communicate the information?
So it comes through several different strategies. Some of it is literal. In other words, look at this payload. This payload, we know that. We've seen it. It's bad. Some of it is heuristic. In other words, it's unusual for a Word document to start opening up connections to the internet and talking broadly with large bandwidth of communications. There are multiple stages for how the fight continues, because it's an endless battle. Every time we make a gain in the good guys' side, the bad guys advance their technology. So it's a never-ending story. However, when you have these pieces in place, the story gets much better for the good guys. It is one of those things where the absence of it is greatly more expensive for your end customers than simply preparing in the first part. In the military and intelligence world, they call it being left of boom and right of boom. So left of boom is everything that happens and leads up to the point where there's a big bad event. And then right of boom is everything that happens after the bad event occurs. And a lot of statistics have been compiled. Your customers will have to pay 70 times the amount of money to deal with a problem to the right of boom than they would have if they had taken care of that problem left of boom. So you are significantly improving your customers' budgets when you help them to find their way to good solutions that keep them left of boom.
Okay. Josh, do you want to add anything to that as far as how the different endpoints are able to determine? How do hackers get around endpoint solutions? Let's say you've got that in place.
So you have what you would consider a physical-based attack as well as digital. So physical-based attacks could be emulation of devices. So a lot of people have heard of the USB rubber ducky. That's an emulation-based device. There's Keezies. There's all these different things which use an Arduino-based hardware solution to emulate something that is actually like a keyboard. And it would be a malicious device, and it would execute as a keyboard, but it's not a keyboard. That is one way to bypass an endpoint protection solution, because it's trying to, based upon it, as Brett said, or to dumb it down even more, signatures of a device or signatures of a software, right? So a lot of people are detecting, and endpoint protection solutions could protect you against Metasploit frameworks, reverse TCP-based shells. So one thing an attacker might do is they would encode it in a way to bypass the endpoint protection solution. But this is, again, breaks down to a heuristic-based engine, which would say, should a Word doc be executing a PowerShell script that is going and communicating out to the rest of the World Wide Web to pull something down? More than likely not. But what it comes down to is your security is as good as you know your own tools. So a lot of it is the tool, you might have it, but it isn't set up in the proper way. And so because it hasn't been set up, or because someone implemented it and didn't know how to configure it in a way that it would work for them instead of working against them, they now have the solution, but the solution hasn't been integrated into the rest of their infrastructure in an appropriate manner.
Makes sense. So, and what I'm kind of taking away from this is it's a multi-layered approach.
Right.
You can't just have endpoint security and buy it off the shelf and think that you're good to go. It takes configuring it properly, or else it'll get used against you, and having other solutions on top of that layer. If they get past that, then we've got a SOC solution in place that can protect against that. And I'm guessing, multiple layers on top of that.
So, for example, we also have Recon Radar which is a device that will detect rogue wireless devices, rogue Bluetooth devices. And that, again, is something that gets your eyes on a problem. Hey, why all of a sudden is this phone now 2 phones? And why is that other phone talking to my accounting system when this guy's in sales? So again, there are lots of things that are there, but the tech data strategy and you as the partner can take forward the message to your end customers that says, look, there's no silver bullet. If there was ever a silver bullet, you wake up one day and the world will be named after whoever did that. But until the world wakes up and they call it no longer Earth but Fred, we're going to have to deal with a defense in depth or a multi-phase strategy for dealing with cyber defense. And so Tech Data has put these things together. We do them in the context of the NIST cybersecurity framework, but you as a partner will offer to your end customers solutions, and we as Tech Data have the horsepower to help them work together so that all of those solutions fit together as a single strategy rather than a series of disconnected walls. So the net effect to your end customer is better overall cybersecurity. And then we have our staff, you are one of those people, who helps a partner figure out exactly what to talk with the customer about, because every single company and customer is in a different position. They have a different answer to the how do I make my company secure because of what they have done before today. So this is where you come in. You help companies understand where are they now. We have assessments to assess with that process as well. And then you say, based on where you are, here are the things that you need to add to this process to create a better overall cybersecurity. It's always a multi-stage solution.
Yeah, most people will think that if they do an external-based penetration test and the results come back that they're secure from the perimeter, it means that they're also insecure, that they're secure from the interior. But when you start to include additional measures like social engineering, and you start to see all your users will click on all the things and download items that they're not supposed to, well, I've now penetrated your perimeter security.
Okay. All right, this is great. We're at the top of the hour and need to wrap this up, but appreciate everyone being on the call, and Josh and Brett for your wisdom and insight and years of experience in the trenches. It's so helpful having this. If anyone on the call has any ideas for future calls or questions, feel free to email me, and we will include that in the next the call. Thank you very much, everybody.